Hello everyone, welcome to the second instalment of our EU Cross webinar series. I'm Andrione-Moylan from the Leuven Centre for Global Governance Studies at KU Leuven, and I will be moderating this webinar on contestation, legitimacy, resilience and recentering in the age of anxiety with Professor Kolja Raube, who coordinates the EU Cross network, and Sharon Lecocq from the University of Leuven. Kolja is Senior Member and Research Manager at the Leuven Centre for Global Governance Studies and Assistant Professor and Program Coordinator at the Master of European Studies, Transnational and Global Perspectives at KU Leuven. He is also Adjunct Professor at the Brussels campus of American University based in Washington, DC, and is Visiting Professor at Kobe University, Japan. Kolja Raube has published widely on the European Parliament, interparliamentary cooperation in the European Union and global governance, as well as security policies, the rule of law, legitimacy and coherence in EU external action. In 2019, he co-edited, along with Meltem Muttelenbach and Jan Wouters, a volume on parliamentary cooperation and diplomacy in EU external relations. Sharon holds a master's degree in Egyptology and Comparative and International Politics from KU Leuven. She is Research Fellow at the Leuven Centre for Global Governance Studies and the Leuven International and European Studies Institute at KU Leuven. In her research, Sharon focuses on adopting a decentered approach to the analysis of EU foreign policy and of international relations more broadly. Her geographical areas of focus are the Middle East and Africa. She also co-authored with Professor Stefan Kukeler a journal article entitled Recentring, the Analysis of EU Foreign Policy and External Internal Legitimacy, Reintroducing Polity. So we're very glad to welcome you both to our EU Cross webinar series. EU Cross is a Jean Monnet network co-funded by the Erasmus Plus programme of the European Union entitled The European at the Crossroads of Global Order. It investigates the challenges and opportunities that the European Union and its main international partners face as our conventional understanding of the global order is put into question and multilateralism is contested. So I think today's webinar, which re-examines the EU's role in international affairs, makes for an excellent opportunity to spark further discussion on this topic. Finally, as for the general structure of this webinar, Kolja will present for about 25 minutes, then Sharon will share with us her reflections, and Kolja will have then the opportunity to reply. During the presentations, as always, you may send your questions to me via the webinar chat box, which you can access from the control panel. After the presentations, we will then have our Q&A session and a discussion with our two speakers. It's my pleasure now to give the floor to Kolja, and I very much look forward to his presentation. Kolja, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Alex. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be on this webinar and to take the opportunity to talk to you about contestation, legitimacy, resilience, as it said in the former title, and recentering in the age of anxiety. Before I start, I would like to say a couple of words of thank you. First of all, to Alex for hosting, but also Sharon for coming in spontaneously as a discussant. I'm very honored because Sharon has been widely publishing on decentering, and I guess we will hear more about that later in her discussion. Also, in behind of me, you see Gustavo Müller, who actually has been teaching a course with me in the Master of European Studies here at KU Leuven, where actually we developed some former ideas on recentering together with our students, and parts of what I present today is actually linked to what came out of the course which we taught in fall 2018. Moreover, great thank you to all the colleagues and interested people out there related to the Jean Monnet Network EU Cross, which is running until next year. And I think we have made a couple of really interesting contributions already to how the EU is actually engaging with the world at the crossroads of global order. And certainly my talk today is somewhat related to this. I would also say as a first introduction that a couple of colleagues were approaching me when they saw the title of my talk today, amongst them a good colleague from the University of Ghent, Tom Rose, who actually has been so kind to suggest to actually have a little bit of a soundtrack in the back of my talk by Jamie Cullum, who has recently published a song called The Age of Anxiety. But of course, there's more music out there, such as the Second Symphony of Leonard Bernstein, based on the poem of W.H. Auden. And I think it shows in a way that the title, The Age of Anxiety, refers to a time that we thought was long left behind us, actually, but that is coming back, and people critically kind of about the world they are living in. What is my overall ambition today? The overall ambition of my talk today is to provide you with a model that allows us to think about how a decentered foreign policy of the Union can lead to greater legitimacy in the EU's foreign policy. This is, I should say, research in progress. I mentioned already that some of the ideas are actually stemming from some teaching we did in 2018, and it starts from the assumption that the EU finds itself in an age of anxiety, an age actually of crisis and contestation that undermines the EU's legitimacy in international affairs, but also at home, domestically. This contestation requires a fresh look at how the EU is actually able to regain its status as a legitimate and authoritative actor. If you like, in the words of Simon Duke, to become a stronger global actor in the world again. While several strategic documents of the EU do try to address this quest, for example, the EU's global strategy, it remains unclear how exactly the EU is going to achieve it and for which reason. Building on decentering literature in European foreign policy, I argue that we need a model that not only emphasizes decentered foreign policy as a means to overcome crisis and to lead to more legitimacy of the EU, but also to others, which I call centered and recentered foreign policies. So let me explain in the course of this webinar what I exactly mean by that. To speak with Mike Smith, the EU views itself as a liberal international system in the international liberal order in a situation where the underpinning values and respective institutions of the liberal order are contested, be it human rights, be it regional cooperation, transnationalism, be it internationalism, to just name a few. The problem being that there is a growing contestation of the order by its domestic recipients and constituents. In other words, the legitimacy of the international order at large, but also of the EU resting on the same values of the order, are diminishing. But before we actually think about how the EU can win back legitimacy, we need to think about what we actually mean by legitimacy. According to Helene Sjursen from the University of Oslo, a democratic foreign policy should display a minimum of democratic legitimacy. And this minimum requirement is related to the principles of autonomy, accountability, and accountability. That is, on the one hand, the ability of those affected by laws also to be their authors, autonomy, and whether those decide can be held responsible for their decisions, accountability. So paired with Vivian Schmidt's input, throughput, and output legitimacy, focusing on governing by, with, and for the people, we have an interesting framework, actually, that we can use to assess legitimacy in EU foreign policy, but arguably not only at the inside of the European Union. In order to also be able to assess the EU's external legitimacy, Ben Tondra from the University College Dublin and myself came up with the idea of extending the model of Schmidt to the EU's external domain. So in this idea of actually referring to also EU external legitimacy, we came up with the idea of looking into external input, external throughput, and external output legitimacy. External output legitimacy, which you here also see on the graph, may be said to relate to the participatory quality of decision-making with international partners, both by and sorry, I'm missing my slide here. Sorry, both by and multilaterally. In our example, in our example here, this might be said to relate to the perceived capacity of EU policy actors to listen to partners, for example, and to take account of their views in policy development and negotiations externally. It might also entail active engagement with IGOs, domestic and international NGOs, and a visible and practical commitment to different interests, values, and legitimacies. Now, external throughput legitimacy, following Schmidt's original argument, focuses on the quality of global governance processes, both bilateral and multilateral in nature, that the EU is engaged in. In other words, the quality of policy-making processes, be it decision-making, implementation, and law execution, is not only elementary to the legitimacy of the EU policy-making structure internally, but also to the international order. And beyond the participatory aspect, so external input legitimacy, throughput legitimacy becomes concerned with mutual, agreeable, reciprocal, predictable, fair, and transparent proceedings. Last but not least, there is also external output legitimacy. And this is grounded in the effectiveness, credibility, coherence, and success of foreign policy in the eyes of EU partners and other international actors. The perception of third-party states are of central importance here. Reading of the European Union might well determine, in fact, the extent to which they are open to acceptance or rejection of EU policy preferences, and, in fact, the degree to which the EU loses or gains credibility and recognition by others. Now, this is all a bit abstract and theoretical, so let me tell you in a nutshell where this leaves us in view of decentering and eventually recentering, especially in view of the EU's legitimacy in EU external action, which faces crisis and contestation. First, I would say we may argue with Eikenberry that if the EU wants to regain legitimacy in EU external action, it may need to be rethought and reinvented. The key question then is how to regain legitimacy in EU foreign policy, from contestation to legitimacy. And here we may argue that eventually such a process of regaining legitimacy will only take place through a careful reflection of the kind of contestations that the EU is facing externally, and in fact internally, and through equally carefully drafting substantial and procedural responses. And such responses of the EU could lead, in fact, to greater external legitimacy. And this is where decentered perspectives on EU external action matter, especially in view of the reflection and response that the EU is asked to find in times of looming crisis and contestation. In the word of the Turkish historian Arif Dilek from Duke University, decentering can be seen as an effort to overcome Eurocentrism and, in fact, to bring into modernity the voices and experiences and cultural legacies of others. Now, for the EU foreign policy, decentering then can become a normative device, in fact, to justify action towards greater legitimacy of EU action, especially in view of greater external input, throughput, and output legitimacy. And yet, we should probably not forget that the EU is obviously based on its own interests and values, and that it needs to reflect and respond to crises in the system of EU preferences, taking eventually a more centered Western approach, not entirely steered by decentered attitudes. Now, if we accept these claims, the necessity of a decentered approach in the first place, and the EU firm rooting in its own interests and Western norms, on the other hand, we may need a third category, and a third category to bridge the centered and the decentered perspective as a third way, so to speak. This is what I would call anchoring decentering, or in fact, as Gustavo Müller and myself had coined it last year towards our students, recentring. Anchoring means here that we need to go beyond the analysis of decentering towards an embedding of decentralized embedded in the EU's own interests and values. In other words, contestation leads to the need to decenter, but the EU's perspective on interests and values needs to be filtered back in. You may call this, in fact, a double distillation of decentering. And hence, we may end up with a model of centering, recentering, and decentering, with distinctions of each of the dimensions on how they project EU foreign policy action from taking place and which dimension of legitimacy it would trigger. Arguing with a centered perspective, the EU is likely to take what it currently calls principled pragmatic positions, which are in the first place steered by the idea to arrive at a greater internal output legitimacy, which first and foremost shows European constituents how effective, efficient, and credible the EU is and can be. With the decentered perspective, we actually are concerned with more pragmatic choices I view and benefit in view and benefit of the other. So pragmatic choices that the EU has to take in view and benefit of the other, rather than the EU's own audience. And as such, the recognition by others is essential. While I do not rule out that the decentered perspective can also consider substantive and procedural choices for greater external input and throughput legitimacy, I think the key emphasis here with a decentered perspective is on external output legitimacy. Really coming up with effective policy answers in view of the other that are respective and also recognized by the other. And finally, and acting as a third way, model recentering will anchor decentered perspectives, as I said before, and test, in a way, decentered choices against principles and values of the EU itself. So the primary focus of this recentered perspective is, in fact, a combination of internal and external output legitimacy, if you like, which aims to lead to greater legitimacy in the eyes of European and other constituents. So let me, to illustrate this, run quickly through the differences of each of the models. Here you can see actually the centered model. First, starting with contestation, the centering takes place, a pragmatic approach is searched for in the reflection phase, and a response is basically given, enacted, and implemented in a way to provide for greater external output legitimacy, especially in view of the EU's own audience. In the decentered perspective, we actually have contestation and the focus on the needs, values, but also potential rules and procedures of the other are taken into account. A proper reflection is being undertaken on the side of the EU, and it drafts a response towards towards an effective problem solving that enables the EU to have, in the end, policy output in place which can provide for greater external output legitimacy. In other words, here, as I said before, the audience is not the EU constituent, but in fact the audience are the societies of third country partners. And the answers to the specific contestation are mainly driven by a decentered reflection. Last but not least, we have recentring. And here, I think we have, as you can see, especially in comparison to decentering, this little detour in the reflection phase. So in a way, recentering, as I said before, is very much taking into account a decentered perspective and would also search for answers and responses that are meeting the others' values, principles, rules, traditions, etc. But that in the reflection phase, there is an inbuilt anchoring which brings in the EU's values and principles to see how far can the EU go, how far can the EU go to actually come up with a decentered, so to speak, answer to a problem. Or is there a need to anchor and recenter in view of, for example, the core human rights, rule of law principles that the EU is based on, to recenter such action and to take responses accordingly. And like this, as I said before, there is a balance in the legitimacy between, on the one hand, internal output legitimacy and external output legitimacy, which at the same time tries to speak to the audiences of the EU, the EU's constituents, but also societies of third country partners. So let me briefly conclude at this stage. My overall ambition of the talk today was basically to provide you with a model that allows us to think about how a decent foreign policy of the Union can lead to greater legitimacy in the EU's foreign policy. And I think by providing you with a model of legitimacy and at the same time a model of centered, decentered and recentered EU foreign policy, it tried to arrive at an understanding how we can think of decentered and recentered in line of how legitimacy is fed differently in EU foreign policy. However, and I think we are coming back to this question in our debate as well, it leaves us with a normative riddle. And the normative riddle is basically, can the EU's action be legitimized by a centered or a decentered approach? Or is the EU always in need of a recentered approach? What are, so to speak, the options that the EU has, and what would speak for one option over the other? So thank you very much for listening, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Excellent. Kolja, thank you so much for this highly interesting presentation and sharing your critical reappraisal of EU foreign policy. I would now like to ask Sharon to come into the discussion. So please, you have the floor.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for having me, and thank you so much, Kolja, for a really interesting presentation. I really think it's useful to indeed combine the current debate on decentering with your own work on the multi-tiered nature of legitimacy in EU foreign policy. And I also really like the fact that you're trying to take the discussion forward, that you actually try to think in terms of what would it mean if we use a decentered approach in the practice of EU foreign policy instead of only looking at the analysis of EU foreign policy, and also what does this mean in terms of these different layers or types of legitimacy you mentioned. Now, I would briefly like to start off the discussion with a very, very small presentation of my own, just a bit to contextualize where I come from and what I've been working on in terms of decentering or thinking about in the past few years. So, let's see. Yeah. So actually, centering actually starts from the observation that has already been acknowledged since the end of the 90s, I think. That in
I'm sorry, Sharon, we can't see your screen at the moment. Yes, perfect. Yes. Thank you very much.
Now we can.
Okay, cool.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
That international relations scholars increasingly realized that the discipline itself was actually devised for a Euro-Western-centric setting and also for a Euro-Western-centric audience, which led to a series of, let's say, biases, misunderstandings, and perhaps also the neglect of certain conceptualizations or ideas about international relations that don't necessarily fit within these Eurocentric frameworks. And that this is actually the reason why scholars thought that there was, let's say, a dearth or a poverty in conceptualizing the international, which should actually be a global affair. So decentering was actually kind of proposed as a remedy to these issues, as opposed to, for instance, Euro or Western centrism. Now, specifically, the idea of decentering has been engaged with within the literature. You see some of the people who have worked on it here on the slide. But what is actually interesting is that they don't really build on each other and that there's no, let's say, systematic conceptualization of the idea of decentering. And a second observation is also that in the literature on EU foreign policy, not many scholars have engaged with the idea. And I think the first authors to explicitly engage with decentering were Nora Fischer-Ona and Calypso Nicolai, which actually propose a framework with 3 analytical steps for decentering, being provincializing or questioning Eurocentric accounts, engagement, which means learning from other perspectives on international relations, and then reconstruction, as in renewing EU external relations and analysis based on provincializing and engagement. And we reinterpret this a little bit as first step of self-reflection. Where does the EU stand within international relations? Where does it stand itself, historically and in the present day? Learning about, from, and within the external context towards which EU foreign policy is directed. And then finally, finding elements that contain opportunities or challenges for recalibrating EU foreign policy, which would improve it, make it more responsive and more resilient. Now, a little bit off topic, we further engage with this decentering agenda by combining the 3 steps of Fischer-Ona and Nicolaides with several categories or elements which would engender a different worldview, being space, time, polity, norms, language, but also different disciplinary points of view. But this is less essential for the discussion now. And I promise that this that there is a point to this shameless self-referencing, let's say, because it leads me to my first question, which is, Kolja, how exactly do you position yourself towards this existing literature on decentering? Who are you responding to? And how do you define decentering, you know, giving this limited systematic conceptualization? I heard you mention Dirlik, which I don't know whether he actually engages with decentering as an idea. So my question would actually be, where do you position yourself decentering, and what does your model contribute to this discussion?
Yeah, I'm happy to give you the floor back to you for a reply, and then we will have the Q&A with our audience. So I also remind our audience members that they can send their questions to me via the webinar platform. Kolja, you have the floor.
Alex, thank you very much, Sharon, for this very interesting presentation and also contextualization in a way of the current literature. Indeed, it's something that I didn't refer to in my presentation because I very much treat the decentering agenda, as it is called in your articles, but also in the article of Sharon Lecocq and Nicolaïdis, as an ongoing debate, actually, an ongoing debate which is far from finished. But what I take as a takeaway is actually the first 2 points of Fischer-Onar and Nicolaïdis that you also engage in your article and basically say this is something that we have to take seriously. We have a debate in the literature which has been very much Eurocentric, but in fact the literature has been Eurocentric, while at the same time the practice has probably been quite Eurocentric as well. And we have to try to make sense of what the European Union is about. And this is my very centric perspective. If you look at the books on my shelf, you will see it's all about the EU. So my question is, how can we make a sense of this literature? Now, if you ask me where I come in, I can tell you that I have been working especially around the concept of difference. So the idea for me is really to find ways how to engage in difference. Engage in difference both in the EU, but also outside the EU. And in a way, it always is a challenge in the EU, because the EU is meant to be very consistent, it's meant to be very effective, it's meant to be very efficient, but then we have diversity and difference. We have diversity and difference within the EU, and we have diversity and difference outside the EU. So how can we best make sense of this? My understanding here is that actually we have not made sense of this enough, and this is why I find the decentering approach so enticing from my particular point of view, and I should have probably mentioned that at the beginning. So an understanding of decentering, I think, brings about difference and actually how to engage in difference and how to make sure that actually we see difference as a potential, not as something negative, but as actually something that is useful and that is normatively to be respected and recognized. And I think this is very crucial, both in international affairs, but also within the EU. If you see some of the trends that we see in international affairs, obviously, and obviously also in the EU, it works actually quite nicely against this. So my normative point of view is not only the analytical point of view, but also normative point of view. Well, if difference is actually something that is to be respected and recognized, then it should also be recognized, and then the EU should make sense of it. And I think this is something where I come in from my particular understanding of difference and why it makes sense to engage in it, and how I relate to the decentering agenda. So I think it is important that there is also an afterthought here. If you wish, it's a training exercise for everybody, for individuals, for groups, but also for the EU. If you take difference seriously, you always reflect upon yourself. You always reflect upon what can I do better? What can I do differently? How do I potentially find a different solution to a problem that I'm facing? And I'm looking at somebody else, I'm looking at another country, I'm looking at another organization, and potentially I see alternative ways of dealing with matters. So in a way, this is a self-reflexive exercise, engaging in difference, and I think that the EU can greatly benefit from that exercise. So that's a second argument, why we need to engage in the decentering agenda, but also more in practice, why we need to engage in difference. A last point here is, and this would be my next step. If I told you this is research in progress, there is a literature. I think that the decentering agenda, so to speak, and debate has overlooked. There are some reflections already in the early 2000s by Beck and Grunde, for example, about cosmopolitan Europe, where they actually argue that engaging in difference is something that will enable the European Union to find its way also in terms of more legitimacy, but also effectiveness. And by difference, they actually think about a permanent discourse, of how to engage in cultural and other differences. And this literature that is very much driven by an understanding of the European Union, I think is very meaningful, and it would actually be quite nice to bring these two literatures together and to think about how we can make sense of what the EU is doing both internally and externally. And last but not least, because you were asking me how do I refer to this literature, I would like, and I think Calypso Nicolaidis has done that already quite a bit when she writes about democracy in the European Union, but I would also like to think about taking decentering seriously within the EU, not only as a tool to understand European foreign policy externally, but also on the one hand, the making of EU foreign policy internally and how decentering makes sense there, looking into national parliaments, looking into NGOs, looking into peripheries of the European Union. How much do we look into this? But also more broadly speaking, I think it's a very, very useful tool to understand some of the dilemmas that the EU is currently in with regards to overcoming Euroscepticism and the crisis of legitimacy that the EU is currently
in. Wonderful. Thank you both very much for kicking off already a lively discussion. We have our first questions from our audience. We can start with Theodor Moga, who asks and wonders whether what is portrayed by the European Union as its pragmatic approach based on resilience isn't in fact revealing of a more defensive approach to foreign policy, of an EU that is in some way in retreat from global affairs. We then have Darius Ribe, who, looking at the new developments for the new European Commission, wonders if you have any recommendations for Borrell, the new High Representative of the European Union. And finally, and with this I conclude this first round of questions, we have two questions from Gustavo Muller. One for Kolja, who suggests that perhaps this decentering, recentering approach that you have presented could be an opportunity for non-traditional foreign policy actors, such as the European Parliament, to perhaps engage more effectively with this policy area. And perhaps you can elaborate how, at the end of input legitimacy, how could this be done, essentially, and how would this happen in practice? And for Sharon specifically, again from Gustavo Müller, the decentering agenda and the literature surrounding the decentering agenda is very much rooted in the post-colonial literature. Is it not time to renew our approach to the decentering agenda in view of the great rebalancing that we've witnessed in terms of global power balances, of course, so with the rise of China, India, and so forth, and also fundamental changes when it comes to norms and so on. I give the floor back to perhaps Sharon, and then back to Kolja again.
Yeah, thank you so much for these questions. Maybe to the first one, I'll pick out two, and then maybe Kolja can take two more, which is this pragmatic approach to EU foreign policy and whether or not the EU is actually in retreat. I think this has also to do with the fact that the EU itself, I mean, internally doesn't seem to be sure anymore about what exactly its values are, or there seems to be internal contestations of how to behave with regards to its norms, its values, its principle, its interests. I think there is maybe a feeling not only within the EU, but perhaps also outside the EU, if I talk to people, that the EU might need to get first its own thing before it moves to the international stage in promoting these values and principles. So I think there is definitely a connection there. I don't know if this answers completely your question, but that for the first part. Then with regards to Gustavo's question on the post-colonial literature, I'm not sure I completely understood the question. Was it whether or not we should engage more with the post-colonial literature? Because it's indeed true that much of this, let's say, more critical approaches to international relations and about its Western centrism and about, the underlying, say, that are involved within also the analysis of international relations, are very much rooted indeed in this post-colonial literature. What I find as a scholar of international relations who has worked now a few years on EU foreign policy, I find it quite a difficult literature to engage with. And what we try to do with the decentering agenda is trying to make it very concrete, let's say, to the literature on EU foreign policy, on how to engage with this set of ideas, let's say, in a language that we are used to within this small subdiscipline, let's say. So we try to bring in these ideas of decentering, which are very much rooted indeed in the post-colonial, but we don't necessarily put ourselves into the post-colonial literature, so to say. Then with regards to this great power, this is also one of the main, let's say, drivers of why we think decentering is necessary, because international relations is not about Europe centrism or Western centrism anymore, because we see indeed these rise of China, this rise of emerging powers, let's say, who are becoming more and more influential. So really trying to understand what makes them tick, but also makes them appealing to other countries, maybe even more so than the European Union, can only be beneficial for an effective and efficient EU foreign policy. There.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sharon. Kolja, you may go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for all the questions. I will try to answer them as much as possible. And I think, in themselves, they are really good reflections, and they probably should be raised much more often over the next weeks and months. Starting with the question whether whether the pragmatic approach of the European Union that we currently see enshrined in the global strategy is actually revealing some sort of retreat. I find that a very interesting thought. I was thinking more about it so far as a way that the EU tried to bring two things together which were very difficult to actually bring together, and that is on the one hand pragmatism and on the other hand its principles. So it called it principle pragmatism, but how do you do this? For me, this is not clear. You could of course say it's not clear, and so the EU is actually retreating from any sort of strategy or strategic approach. But I would not go as far as this. I would rather say that the EU has, as very often before in the global strategy, and we should not forget how the global strategy was written, obviously, opted for some sort of a middle ground, if not a smallest common denominator, looking into its principles, but at the same time saying, you know, we need to become more strategic, we need to become more pragmatic. But how do you do this? How do you operationalize this? Is for me still very unclear, and I personally fear that some of the principles that the EU is guided by may actually become an afterthought, whereas others may say, you know, you have to be more pragmatic, and this is exactly where perhaps the decentered approach is and the recentering approach is also somewhat, you know, really facing problems. How do you bring it together? How do you bring it together when on the one hand you are asked to take some pragmatic action that also speaks towards some of the opportunities, the perceptions of a third actor, and we may not always call and remind ourselves of let's call it them smaller international actors. We may also think about China and Russia and others. How do you bring these demands together with the principles that the EU is driven by and that it is rooted in? Very difficult, and for me it is still not very clear how the EU wants to do this. But as I said before, probably the EU has to engage in a discourse, and it needs to take at the same time the perceptions on the one hand of others seriously, the demands, the needs, the interests, but it also has to treat its own interests and values seriously. How you bring this together is very difficult, but the EU is not an easy organization. So I think this is something that the EU is actually well trained for, as it is actually a multilateral organization, if you like. This brings me to the second question. Josep Borrell, will he be the HRVP? Well, if he survives the European Parliament, then he will be HRVP. But there is obviously an advice for the HRVP, whoever it will be, whether it's Josep Borrell or somebody else in the end. Talk, discourse. Use your diplomatic tools. And I think we have not been very good at this. In fact, the first HRVP was mainly, Lady Ashton was mainly concerned with building up the External Action Service. She had a couple of really big issues to solve, and she did a fairly good job, I would say, in international relations, but she did not yet have a fully fledged agency that could back her up. Mogherini was very much focused on strategy, on developing a European foreign policy based on a new strategy, but in the end she dealt actually more with defense, I would say, than with foreign policy over her 4 years. But what the EU needs to do is talk. Discourse. We have not engaged in a really high level constructive discourse, for example, with the United States, I would argue. We really need to talk to the contesters, and this is very important, especially because we are living, as the title of my talk today said, arguably in an age of anxiety. So people want, I think, in the EU, but also outside the EU, that we, despite all the frictions, despite all the various clashing interests that we currently see, they want to see some light. And I think some of that light could come in through diplomatic tools, through actually engaging and always reminding ourselves that even talking to those who supposedly are currently not our allies and our friends are still very important to engage with, because diplomacy doesn't end, it goes on. And that is my advice, I think, for the next 5 years. 2.5 for the HRVP, because it needs to be 2.5 years, 2.5 years. Anyways, last one, Gustavo, sitting behind me, asking a question about what does all of this mean for non-conventional actors. I would say, read our new book on parliamentary cooperation and diplomacy. I think there's a lot in there that you can potentially find interesting to learn about how parliamentary actors, for example, engage with third country actors, and how they sometimes are actually open to the discourse that I was talking about earlier, but also how they are reproducing in a way a foreign policy that is very much led by the EU institutions at large, and that is trying to sell rather than to listen the European model. And I think this is probably not the way to go in a world where the EU is increasingly losing influence.
Many thanks, Kolja. I think we definitely have time for a final round of a short round of questions. First of all, we have Francisca, who puts to you, Kolja, Francisca Costeres, who puts to you, Kolja, a critical question. In other words, some argue that in current times, legitimacy doesn't seem to matter as much as it did. And in light of this, does your framework really reflect the realities of how policymaking actually is taking place currently? Perhaps you can start with that question, and then I'll get back to you with some more.
You don't have a second one so that I can reflect a little bit more? Okay.
Well,
no, I will answer directly. That's fine. That's fine. I think that's right. I think, you know, people are not concerned with legitimacy. You know, there is no way of how you can, as citizens, engage in a concept like legitimacy. It's very difficult. But it's a little bit like blood pressure. You know, if your blood pressure is too low, you're probably not in a very healthy state, even though you're never concerned with your blood pressure. And if the blood pressure is too high, similar things can happen to you. So for legitimacy, there's no such thing as a too high legitimacy. I think that's a good thing. If you're highly legitimate, that's a good thing. But it becomes a problem if even though you are not concerned about your own legitimacy, the environment that you are working in detects that you have problems justifying your points. So you need to be legitimate. You need to be a legitimate actor. You need to have the backing of your population. You need to be able to show to the world that when you talk about human rights and the rule of law, that you actually mean it. And if you are not able to keep your house in order, and the EU faces a couple of problems with regards to the rule of law and relatedly to human rights in some of its member states at the moment, then it has a problem about legitimacy, even though legitimacy as a concept doesn't matter. But for the EU, it matters a great deal, I would say.
Perfect, thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, I was waiting for some extra questions to come in, and we do have some extra questions. First of all, Dale Minashima Lowe, who would like you to elaborate more on the role of non-traditional actors in EU foreign policy. But also, so not only when it comes to more institutional actors like the European Parliament, but also civil society and the role these kinds of non-state actors can play in the decentering, recentering scheme of things. And of course, I think Sharon, you can come in here and kind of bring your perspective as well. And then secondly,
okay.
Secondly, we have Carrie Otterburn, who brings in the member states, of course, and what does this mean in the context of a policy area where, of course, the member states ultimately still play a very significant role, and which often undermines, let's say, the outside legitimacy of the European Union as a unified actor. So perhaps you could share with us some further reflections on taking into account that issue. Okay, back to you.
Can I just quickly, sorry, to rephrase perhaps the first question, because it was kind of scrambled a little bit my screen, so a bit distorted. I didn't understand it.
Of course, no problem. It's about the role of non-state actors in EU foreign policy within the decentering, recentering scheme that we discussed. So not only parliaments, but also civil society actors.
Okay.
Okay.
For that question, shall I quickly get this one? Yeah. So about non-state actors and civil society in EU foreign policy, well, it depends. There are, of course, let's say, several stages of the EU foreign policy making process in which such non-state actors could be engaged, but also, of course, let's say, different implications for different layers of legitimacy in Kolja's scheme, let's say, talking about involving non-state actors already from the beginning of the drafting of the foreign policy. Do we want to actually engage with their views on what the foreign policy should look like? And what kind of implications does this have? I mean, can we just, let's say, go around a third state and actually engage investors first and getting their views in? And how would this impact on the relationship with this country? So I think here, you know, there is also a question of what does engaging mean? How do you also engage without necessarily endorsing? Because I remember Kolja saying before that it's quite important to include all stakeholders in decision making. Let's say in the making of EU foreign policy, also the ones we don't necessarily agree with. But what kind of implications does this also have for the internal legitimacy of EU foreign policy? Can we engage with them? Will member states actually agree with that? So there are very different and elaborate layers, I think, to this question, which are very interesting to explore. So yeah, I think I don't have a clear-cut answer. Yeah, I think that's an interesting path of further research.
Yeah, perhaps quite practically speaking, on the non-traditional actors, NGOs, for example, perhaps we have to look into some of the EU funding of projects, which is currently going on through different schemes in development with regards to human rights, with regards to post-crisis conflict prevention, etc., and look into to which degree the EU is actually able to engage non-traditional actors there, and it actually engages a lot with non-traditional actors there, but also how are the projects undertaken? What is actually the bottom line of the projects? Very often you have the feeling that this is still very much a bit what the EU doesn't like to hear these days, that the EU is preaching a certain policy outside rather than engaging in some of the needs that people have on the ground. I think it becomes, it changes, but it's important to look into how the EU interacts with these actors through some of the projects, and whether these projects would reflect to a certain degree in the future, perhaps, what has been coined a decentered agenda. Going from a more centered approach based on Brussels' interest towards more of a, let's say, grassroots approach that is also taking literally more needs on the ground into account, rather than the grand ideas, for example, of development cooperation as they are developed in the EU, in Brussels mainly. So that would be a first reflection. Second reflection is the question of the member states. Well, it's true. I mean, member states can sometimes be, from a European perspective, somewhat inconsistent actors. They can push certain things forward without coordinating. They sometimes do things because they say foreign policy is still our domain of sovereignty, so it's our right to do so. But at the same time, let's also focus on what the member states are. They have a lot of resources. They have a lot of history, not always the best history, but they have a lot of history, and they are the eyes and ears of Europe in international affairs. We have more than 130 delegations of the European Union all around the world, but there are also the member states which are out there, and they have a lot of expertise. So I think, in a way, to respond to what Carrie asked, let's also see the member states as actually a way to engage in a more decentered agenda. Not only the EU institutions, but also the member states, and how willing are they to take this on? Perhaps they're even a step further. It would be a fascinating research agenda to compare this, actually, to which degree there is a variety, and to which degree certain member states are actually better than others, so to speak, at, for example, listening and taking needs on the ground seriously. But in any way, I would not necessarily say that European Union member states are always destructive. They can be very constructive tools, and actually not only tools, but fundamental actors of European foreign policy.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm afraid this is all the time that we have for today. I would really like to thank our speakers, Professor Kolja Raube and Sharon Lecocq, for this excellent discussion, as well as our audience members, of course, for taking part in this EU Cross webinar. Our EU Cross webinar series will return after the summer break, so please stay tuned for our updates on our website, as well as on our Twitter accounts at EU Cross. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you will join us again next time. From Kolja, Sharon, and myself, thank you and goodbye.
Bye-bye.